One of the most misunderstood topics derived from folklore and Fortean subjects is that of fairies. In a post-Disney world and culture, fairies have become synonymous with Tinkerbell, with harmless, lovable sprites who are generally seen as female, small, and altogether charming and lovable, even sexy. This is completely at odds with the folklore and mythological traditions concerning fairies all over Europe. The term itself has become synonymous with this Disney invention, but before Christians demonized it, the term fairy had remarkable power and mystery. The term itself, even in countries like Ireland and other Celtic countries, could bring a sensation of dread and very serious reactions in people exposed to it. Irish people went to extreme lengths to avoid the fairies. Fairy folklore and fairy experiences still exist in common everyday usage of language to the present. A good example is the term stroke, to suggest that a sudden or crippling effect of reduced blood flow to the brain comes directly from a belief that people were fairy struck, and the term fairy struck led directly to stroke. It's an incredibly universal idea that we share our landscape with these magical beings, and it goes back beyond the Bronze Age and can be found in most cultures and mythological schools. Fairy folklore and fairy religions were all but stamped out in Europe with the arrival of Christianity, and then again a re-emergence of interest during the Victorian times in England, when folklorists began to gather up the experiences of growing interest in what was then a disappearing remnant of animism. Since those Victorian studies and cataloguing of the fairy tradition, those interested in fairy folklore tend to treat the subject as a form of cultural investigation in a very disconnected way from the actual effect that fairy folklore had upon the communities in which it was central to their belief systems. Another side of it, and it really has its origins in Evan Wentz's study on the subject back in the early 20th century, is that people are still reporting fairy encounters. But like magic, the fairy idea evolves with culture and time. In Ireland, fairies and demons are almost interchangeable in terms of how they're seen by people in rural areas. And this could be expanded also into the modern ideas of ufology. For example, the abduction experience made well known in books such as Whitley Strieber's Communion, and which was all the rage during the 80s and 90s. Just about all of these experiences are identical to the Irish fairy abduction experience. You have all the classic elements: appearance of strange lights, a sensation of missing or lost time. The interior of the spacecrafts and the interior of the fairy world are almost described identically in terms of they're unhygienic, they are intimidating, and the fairies and the aliens both damage the people in certain ways, causing either sexual or physical trauma, taking samples of blood and so on. While it's very difficult to establish what the fairy folk belief is and what fairies themselves are, there's no doubt that it ties into ufology, ghosts, shamanism, spiritual or religious visions such as those seen at Fatima in Portugal in the early 20th century, and many other fields of Fortean or paranormal event, particularly demonology. It would be almost impossible to prove that fairies exist in any kind of objective study in terms of an incorporeal reality, but absolutely there's something going on. Whether it's psychological, cultural, emotional, or paranormal, it's a universal belief. In Ireland, they're referred to as the good people. You also get that in parts of England and Scotland as well. And this is strange because experiences with fairies are anything but good for the most part. They're often malicious, generally naughty, and sometimes absolutely pathological. The term good people kind of seen as a mantra in order to patronize or placate their powers over ordinary rural people. Another term used in Ireland and other countries is the little people. Now this is interesting because fairies are not always little people, although that seems to be the common reported type of fairy. There are fairies that are elvish and tall, like the gentry of this part of Ireland that I live in, who are known to be urban sophisticates. And this brings up another interesting aspect, is that they're often shapeshifters. They can modify or alter their appearance to suit any particular event, time or culture, and have even manifested as giants. In Central Europe, they're often seen as the lost souls of people who have died, or in Catholic countries such as Italy and southern France as fallen angels. Another interesting idea that they represent a kind of race memory, in that we are getting insights to our earliest proto-human forms through these visions of what we call the little people or the fairies, an ancestral memory. Since the 1990s, the likes of Jacques Villée and other UFOologists have firmly incorporated the fairy idea into that of the UFO alien abduction idea, but in recent times it seems to have diverted again, although there's no doubting that many of the classic UFO abduction stories are absolutely fairy folklore brought up to the present. One of the more disturbing stories surrounding fairies encounters is people reporting fairies attempting to steal the shadow cast by people standing in sunlight, using a knife or using their hands to try and lift or pull the shadow off the ground, and until the person runs, the shadow is partially harvested. Of course, there's all kinds of psychological aspects to this in terms of the shadow being both literal and metaphorical. But this also suggests something outside the bounds of normal space-time reality, and what it represents in terms of the base that we as individuals' nervous systems occupy within this five-sense reality. Are there battles in the fairy world as there are on this earth? You've seen my recent video on ley lines. If these ley lines are of an electromagnetic nature, there is positive and there are negative ones. The positive ones are followed by animals such as badgers and foxes who seem to leave incomprehensible trails across the countryside, avoiding things that aren't there instead of taking the shortest, safest route. These animals probably still possess the same environmental awareness that we've lost of electromagnetic forces in the landscape. By extension, are the so-called negative spots, the fairy paths, where rural people in this part of the world told their children never to follow or never to walk along, for fear they would be abducted by the fairies or have missing time experiences. Are they the negative energy charged lines within the ley phenomena? As one begins to study fairies, folklore, mythology, magic, megaliths, ley lines, and many other Fortean phenomena, one begins to step back and see that all these topics are very closely interrelated in terms of human culture and emerging sciences such as quantum mechanics. Science has only deepened these mysteries, and rather than push the fairies away from us, in actuality they brought us closer to them.